Hi everyone, welcome to our week on the 18th century, and we're going to focus mainly on France, although we are going to touch some on art of Britain and art of the United States in this period as well. So in this period, I want us to be able to understand a number of different things, but mainly how we have these wide switch in styles that occur. So you're going to start in the Baroque period, which you see here on the left, that kind of leads into the Rococo, which I'll define in a second. And then we'll switch from that into Neoclassicism. So this is going to help us, I think, as we start to move into the modern era. We're not quite there yet, modernism with a big M, that is. And so I want to be able to discuss the change in European and American taste in art in the mid 18th century, and also explain what happens, the characteristics, the causes of neoclassicism in Europe and America at this time. So we're going to be able to hopefully be able, by the end of this lecture, to compare and contrast the subject matter and the stylistic features of Rococo and neoclassical art. So these are two wildly different styles, but we're going to see that there are changes in the attitudes, the worldviews, the economy, the politics, the geography, the society of the 18th century. And this is all related to a number of really important concepts and events. We're going to mention the Industrial Revolution, the Enlightenment, and the discovery of ancient Roman art in Herculaneum and Pompeii that happens in the second half of the 18th century. And then, of course, the French and American revolutions. You can't really understate how important these things are. And so just to show you here in this map that by the end of the 18th century and then into the 19th century with the rise of Napoleon, you see France really hit its zenith in its power. You see that the green obviously is the French Empire. All the orange that you see are countries dependent on France, and then the pink are French allies. So France has this kind of monopoly or empire over a lot of Europe. So I think that's really important to kind of see. So there's a lot of wealth in this era, and also France has a lot of power, and so we're going to see French culture be disseminated. Okay, but notice here that the UK, that England and Scotland, they're not really associated with France, or they're not under France's thumb, and so we're going to see similarities and differences, and that's also going to translate into the United States as well. So as we get started, I want you to read these two different kind of sections here about the Enlightenment, Angelica Kauffman, and Neoclassicism, A Century of Revolutions, Rococo, and then also the Femmes Savantes and the Salon Culture, Architecture, and Salon de la Princesse. So read through these, be able to do these things when you're finished. You can pause or take a screenshot of this if you need to right now to make sure that you're able to get the major concepts here. But I want to start off today going back to this very fancy depiction of Louis XIV. Now, Louis XIV was a French king. He reigned from 1661 to 1715, and so this particular work I think is important for us today as we've moved out of the Baroque period, or we're moving out, I guess we should say, that this work is kind of a bridge between the Baroque and the Rococo, and again I'll define that term for you in a second. So France had become the most powerful European nation by the end of the 17th century, and this culminated in Louis's reign. And Louis learned how to use art as propaganda, and he was a huge political strategist. France at this time was an absolute monarchy, which meant all power lay with the king. And Louis is famous for having said, "L'état c'est moi," or "I am the state." Basically, I am everything, I am the government, anything you need, I am. So he ruled with a heavy hand. He gave his nobles lots of benefits, but very little in the way of power. So there would be increasing dissatisfaction with the idea of a monarchy under his rule. He legitimized his rule by claiming a divine right to rule, as did so many rulers before him, but he claimed his power was God's will, and he came to be called the Sun King because he was supposed to be the center of the universe. So we're talking about a guy with a little bit of an ego, if you get what I'm saying. He clearly used art to serve his rule and as propaganda, and Rigaud was one of his favorite painters. So this is another court painter that we're talking about here, and he's shown here as an absolute monarch. Now, Louis would have been 63 when this was painted, so there's a lot going on that we need to talk about. This is first and foremost an ostentatious display of his wealth and grandeur. But notice how his hair is still dark. So the artist is clearly manipulating the image to show him in a recognizable manner, but also he's trying to show himself as a younger man than he actually is, still idealized somewhat. Notice the wealth of his clothing, of his cloak in particular. This is his coronation robe, and it's lined in fur, very expensive fur at that, and it's decorated with the fleur-de-lis, the symbol of France. He's wearing a sword at his hip to commemorate his military power, and he has his hand on the royal scepter. His crown is on the table behind it. So this is all, again, reinforcing the idea that he is the sovereign king, right? And you have this column behind him that's classical in feeling, and it might call the viewer, if the viewer is a kind of erudite or knowledgeable viewer, to compare Louis to the great Roman emperors who he tried to copy or emulate. One of my favorite parts about this particular portrait is that he shows off his legs because he was apparently very proud of them. He was a dancer in his youth, so I just kind of love this little bit of sass that he kicks out there. Compositionally, he is at the center and he's appearing to look down at the viewer, so it's all kind of to reinforce his status, right? He has red high-heeled shoes that are indicative of him as well, because apparently he was actually quite short. But they also, as many of us know, especially the ladies, high heels do wonders for your calves. So if you're trying to, show off your legs, this is the way to do it. He commissioned this gift, Louis XIV commissioned this painting as a gift for someone else, but apparently he loved it so much that he kept it for himself, and he placed it over his throne to act as his stand-in or his proxy when he was away. And apparently visitors were forbidden from even turning their backs on the painting. So this gives you an idea of how much he loved it. The death of Louis XIV occurs in 1715, and so this is going to usher in huge historical changes with the French monarchy, and that's why I wanted to start with this depiction of Louis, to kind of see where we've been and see where we're going from here. Here we see European royalty at the height of its power and also the height of France as well. In the 18th century, Paris will become the social capital of Europe. So as I said, Louis died in 1715 and he left a power vacuum. He had made himself so powerful that there wasn't really a strong enough figure to take his place. So the aristocrats that had formed part of his court started to agitate for more power, more status. And so what we're going to see coming out of this period is that the art focuses a lot on the lives of the aristocracy and the wealthy in addition, or maybe in place of the art, like focusing on the royals, okay? So after the king's death, these French aristocrats enjoyed in greater power and freedom. They moved to Paris, where they started to erect very opulent dwellings in the new Rococo style. Now these dwellings, or Rococo interiors, were called salons, and please note that this is different from the French salons that I'm going to introduce to you later on in this presentation. But Rococo is the name that denotes this artistic style that's flourishing in France in the first half and in the middle of the 18th century. The name comes from the French word rocaille, which is this small decorative shell, pearl, pebble, or stone, typically an irregular pebble, right, or an irregular pearl. So this already gives you a sense of the decorative character of the new style, especially as demonstrated in this particular interior, the interior of the Hôtel de Soubise in Paris that you see here. Now, hôtel is not a hotel as we understand it, but hôtel is a townhouse of the French higher class. And the Salon de la Princesse, which you see below, is one of the rooms of this particular Hôtel de Soubise, and it was made by a number of artists, including the architect Germain Boffrand and the painter Charles-Joseph Natoire and the sculptor J.B. Lemoyne. And so all of these guys are working together to create this incredibly opulent interior. And so notice that some of the hallmarks of Rococo interiors is that, first of all, it's pretty busy visually, right? There's not a lot in here, not a lot of blank space, so to speak. And so it's opulent, it's asymmetrical. There's not a lot of pure symmetry here. It's extremely decorative where curving and irregular lines dominate. So notice that the cornices of the room, the top part, right, where the walls meet the ceiling, the cornices aren't straight, but they seem to kind of move and fuse with the paintings below. You have a variety of gilded ornaments that fill the walls and imitate natural motifs like foliage or flowers, and then you have mirrors just about everywhere you look that complement the interior and enhance this illusionistic theatrical character of the entire room. So if we're talking Rococo, I want you to think about ornament, I want you to think about undulating lines, curves, and lots of flourishes everywhere you look, okay? So the style becomes associated with this style that's popular with the aristocracy. It's based on charm and finesse. And there's also this sense as we move forward that's important to note now that it's about this kind of artificiality of aristocratic taste and values. And we'll unpack what that means later, but think about how all of this is put to be this artifice of wealth, of grandeur, and of these values that the aristocratic class had at this point. Okay, so in terms of Rococo painting that we're going to move into, we can note the achievements of basically three really popular and distinguished French artists at the time: Antoine Watteau, who we're looking at here, Francois Boucher, and Jean-Honoré Fragonard. So we're going to start with the first one. And Watteau is known for his genre of painting called the Fête Galante, or the Amorous Festival. And that's Amorous Festival. And as most of the Rococo paintings, these amorous festivals feature the scenes of the entertainment of the French aristocracy. So that's what we're looking at here. These scenes are often very theatrical, focused on love stories. And that's what we have here. Now, Watteau has the return from, or pilgrimage to, depending on which scholar you're reading, Cythera. And essentially what this is showing a group of aristocratic lovers arriving at the island of Cythera. This is an island devoted to Aphrodite and known for eternal youth and love, Aphrodite or Venus, whichever you'd like to associate here. So note that the figures are playful, they have different postures, they show various theatrical gestures and feature very opulent, rich costumes. This also shows the kind of theatrical character of the scene in addition to the current fashions of the time. The colors of their dresses are painted in very pastel-like colors. You can see that the textures of the material are shimmering and the brushwork is pretty loose. Okay, so textures, loose brushwork, these features become a hallmark of Rococo painting. So to the right, we see a sculpture of Aphrodite. If you see on the far right side, this representation or reference to the classical past, and she's decorated with flowers that the young lovers surely brought for her. Then you have a number of cupids that you see floating through the scene, communicating this idea of Aphrodite and love. And again, the figures are all elegantly dressed and they're in this mode of transition. You have a golden ship on the left to either drop them off or take them somewhere else. Again, we're not entirely sure what status they are right now. Overall, it seems like a pretty light-hearted scene of aristocratic leisure, but some people actually remark on the air of melancholy within the work. They say the sky is a little bit overcast. As they prepare to leave, there's a sense of disappointment. It could be mentioning the kind of transitory nature of romantic love. However you'd like to read that, this is a pretty good example of Rococo painting. And here I hope it also becomes evident how Rococo artists are building on what had come before them in the Baroque period. So you can see these same kind of swirling compositions. Really, the difference between the Baroque and the Rococo is that there's more ornament, more flourishes, and also kind of a less deep subject matter, if that makes sense. But notice how we have all of these kind of different elements that you can see Watteau taking from a work of art like Rubens' Arrival of Marie de Medici at Marseille and pushing them as far as they could go, including these kind of, floating, flying tributes that are above the normal day-to-day action of this life, right? So again, this is a really good example. It's the Fête Galante, this kind of amorous festival. And so we see these aristocratic folks gathering together, having a very nice time, focusing on love and amorous love at that. And particularly French people at this time are known for having a number of affairs, mistresses, etc. So all of that, especially in the aristocratic class, is at play here. Watteau died in his late 1930s from tuberculosis, but the style that he introduces here continues to be popular until it's eventually displaced by neoclassicism. The style will increase in frivolity and in this kind of lighthearted theme. Here, we're going to switch and show you Francois Boucher, and he was an extremely popular artist in 18th century France. He kind of picked up where Watteau left off. He enjoyed commissions of the mistress of the King of France, Louis XV, the Madame de Pompadour, who was a really powerful woman in the art scene and the politics of the time, and so that he was kind of one of her favorite artists, and so he had a pretty good status at the time. Now here in the Toilette of Venus, Boucher is painting Madame de Pompadour as the goddess of love and beauty, Venus, who's surrounded by putti. These cupids are little angels, often understood as the attributes of Venus and associated with her son, Cupid or Amor. But notice some similarities here, right? The colors are again very pastel-like, the textures are shimmering. Notice too what she's surrounded by. You have jewelry, opulent Rococo decoration that's present in the painting. Now the figure of Venus is nude. She's very sensuous. She's playful. Notice how Boucher paints the flesh of the bodies, okay? This also can kind of maybe go back to Rubens and his fleshy women, I don't know, but this is again becoming a hallmark of Rococo painting as well. So this whole painting is framed by these two very satiny curtains, and they're painted with these kind of diagonals, right? So they frame the scene and they emphasize the opulent character of the Rococo interior where the scene takes place. I mean, take a look at the furniture that she's sitting on, everything that she's surrounded by. This is very, very opulent. So in the French Rococo style, the aristocracy was represented playing various theatrical and imaginary roles, such as here with the mistress of Louis XV playing the goddess Venus. So here I want to give you another example by Boucher, and I want you to practice by yourself and take a look at this painting and begin to think, how does this artwork exemplify the Rococo style? What is Rococo about this particular painting? Okay? Let you pause, think about that for a minute. I want to switch now to maybe the most Rococo of any Rococo paintings, the Rococoist painting that we have. This is the Swing by Fragonard. And Fragonard is another French painter of the Rococo period, and the playfulness of his artistic style is masterfully shown here in this pretty famous work called The Swing. So what is Rococo about this? First of all, you see these light kind of pastel colors. There is a decorative exuberance. So if you think about the interior that we looked at, the Salon de la Princesse, that here we have a very also busy composition. There is not a spot here essentially that is left blank, right? There's vegetation, there are flowers, there are figures, there, even the trees, leaves, all of this kind of stuff pulls together and makes for a very decorative exuberance, as I said. Now, this is characterized also by thin layers of paint. There's a very smooth surface here. So if you were to look at this from an angle, it's very thin that he uses to build layers of paint. Another aspect of Rococo, we have small figures with very delicate proportions. Her ankle and her foot, like they might just break if you smashed them. Anyway, that's kind of a morbid thought, but whatever. But you have this composition that is flowing. This is a kind of idyllic movement, but there is constant undulation, especially with the trees. And again, we have this theme of romantic love and the aristocracy. Note how the scene is very theatrical, artificial, right? Colors, again, are pastel-like dresses and decoration very opulent. The light is soft, and at some place it's dark and mysterious. All of these things come together to give this kind of theatrical, artificial presentation, right? So this is commissioned by a baron who asked Fragonard for a depiction of a lover's game. This is also known as, with a longer title, as the happy accidents of the swing. So his mistress is pictured on a swing being pushed by a bishop. To put it mildly, this younger baron is getting a very privileged viewpoint of his beloved on the swing. He can look up her skirt, right? She, in turn, kicks off her shoe, which in this era is a wild symbol of sexuality, in the direction of the young baron. So we're getting all of this also to kind of help us with our reading if we didn't get that already. You have all of these sculptures of Cupid, this classical reference in the scene, suggests everything is well because it's a lover's game, right? Also, one of the Cupids raises his fingers to his lips, motioning to keep a secret. The Baron also wanted to include a clever pun with this theme, since he served as the government representative who collected the taxes that were paid by the church. His government title was Receiver of the General Goods Offered by the Clergy. Okay, so Receiver of the General Goods Offered by the Clergy. And so the Baron's title says that he receives goods or taxes from the church, and here, this is a pun, right? Because the clergy, the bishop, is offering this mistress. Okay, so it's a very, very frivolous representation. It's important to note that the Rococo style is already kind of on the wane when Fragonard was working, and a new style was becoming popular, and it wasn't so frivolous that Fragonard wasn't really able to get many more commissions from this period. But this painting is all about play and entertainment, okay? So this gives us a good idea, I think, of Rococo painting and Rococo art in general. If we're looking at Rococo sculpture, I want you to read about it rather than us spend a ton of time talking about it. But I want you to read about Clodion, and after reading, be able to explain the significance of why this work is the size or scale that it is. For instance, or just so you know, it is approximately just a little bit less than 2 feet high. It's made out of terracotta, so it's 1 foot 11 inches and a quarter high. So why is it made this size? And then take a look at it and be able to describe how this sculpture is Rococo and how Clodion works in a Rococo style. So at this point, we're going to kind of shift out of the Rococo, and I want to talk about some cultural things that are going to shape art as we move forward. And the first one being one of the most important things for the next, couple of centuries that we're going to be talking about is the French Art Academy. This is a key feature of art of the later periods. Artists were educated in academies which were very, very conservative. The academies dictated the taste of the day to the students, and academies often encouraged students to adopt conservative styles based on classical and Renaissance models. Also, this is tied into this idea of salons, which we're going to talk about more in a minute, but that the academy is essentially how you become an artist. So you can't really be self-taught, self-trained at this point if you're going to be a professional artist and actually have patrons, have people buy your work and be able to make a living. Okay, so the art academy becomes almost all important, not only just for learning how to paint and anything like that, but paint, sculpt, etc., but to be able to become a working professional artist that is accepted by the public. You're going to be working in the art academy and then kind of getting your start from there. It's also worthwhile to note that these have been around since the 17th century, but they begin to get more and more power. So the art academy becomes this kind of arbiter of taste. They set the taste of the day, and at this point it's, again, very classical, going back to Renaissance and classical models. Now, this isn't necessarily going to be a problem for a while, but it's worthwhile to note, right, that they have kind of one mode of artistic representation, and that they are the powerful person who gets to, or powerful institution who gets to say who gets to be an artist and who doesn't. So that's important to note. Also, another aspect or another facet of French culture that is changing is that we have the Enlightenment. So the playful art of the Rococo period and the life of the French aristocracy began to be strongly criticized during the Enlightenment period. And in the Enlightenment period, they're going to pioneer reason, scientific empirical observation, rationalism, interest in the national world, religious tolerance, and a lot more democratic ideas than was the case before. The absolute power of monarchs, as well as the power of the church, were questioned as people were asked to kind of focus on the freedom of intellect, empirical knowledge, and the concept of progress. These ideas were pioneered by a number of different thinkers and philosophers, mostly from Britain and France, like Isaac Newton, John Locke, Voltaire, and Diderot. So let's talk just for a moment about the political philosophy established by John Locke. So essentially, to give us a very overly simplified thought here, is that, again, there's this emphasis on man's own reason, that new way of thinking about the world independently of religion or myth or legend. There's a focus on scientific or rational thought and reason, that you have to experiment to have verification. And this grows out of Renaissance humanism, but now there's a emphasis on our own reason, not as much on religion at this point. So this philosophy established by John Locke will influence art in the next centuries. He basically says that what we know comes from the perception of our senses, from what we can see and feel and experience. So that any knowledge that is empirically true, that is true for everyone, can be tested. That it doesn't rely on faith, but relies on experiment and observation, which is also, again, tied back to our senses. He also wrote about the laws of nature, essentially that everyone has natural rights to life, liberty, and property, and freedom of thought. If that sounds familiar to kind of the American independence movement, you're spot on, right? Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, all of these American revolutionaries are reading John Locke. So this is really, really important, and that also takes us then to government by the people, for the people. He says that a nation's power is derived from its people, that the people enter a social contract with the government whose purpose is to protect these natural rights of the people, these laws of nature, the right to life, liberty, and property, and freedom of thought. And he said, essentially, if the government fails to do this, to protect these rights, then the people have the right to withdraw support and revolt. So these ideas are going to guide the American Revolution and harbor the French Revolutionary idea that man no longer has to serve God or the aristocracy, so people are set free from political and religious shackles. Okay, so the U.S. will be founded on Enlightenment ideals and specifically on the ideals of John Locke. Okay, so I can't really overstate how important he is. Also, if we're thinking about the kind of French, just to give you a French gloss on what's happening with the French Enlightenment, you're going to have the philosophes, and these are people like Voltaire and Diderot, who, in the spirit of democratization of knowledge, started to lead the Enlightenment's most ambitious project. Diderot published the Encyclopedia, so this first attempt to categorize and catalog all known human knowledge, okay? So many of these ideas are going to lead to the overthrow of the French monarchy during the French Revolution, which starts in 1789. Also, all of this is going to have its effect on artistic expression as well. So caught up in the Enlightenment are these technological advances that essentially spurred the Industrial Revolution, like the invention of a steam engine leading to an increasingly global society. The steam engine will essentially revolutionize the world. Without getting into too much detail, in the Industrial Revolution, we see a wide shift. This happens first and mainly in England, but we're going to see it all over the world, that people begin to move from an agrarian existence, from being farmers, to moving to the cities to become workers in factories. Okay, so there's a shift from rural to urban at this time. But we also have all of these new technological advances like iron bridges. This is the first iron bridge that was built in England around 1780. And all of these things, as you can imagine, are going to radically shift how we perceive society and how we perceive progress in modern life. So the French scientist, the co-editor of the Encyclopedia, Jean d'Alembert, that you have here with this pleasant little smile on his face, right? He expressed the feeling of the changes that were taking place in the middle of the 18th century with these words. He said, "A most remarkable change in our ideas is taking place, one of such rapidity that it seems to promise a greater change still to come. It will be for the future to decide the aim, the nature, and the limits of this revolution, the drawbacks and disadvantages of which posterity will be able to judge better than we can. So take a minute, push pause, reread this statement, because I want you to think about this statement a good bit and think about how you understand these words. So this also will lead us into a new taste in art. How is this going to lead us into a new taste in art? Essentially, in France, as we start, there's going to be a new taste for the natural, right? We saw artificial being the kind of thrust of the Rococo. So you have this other French philosopher, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who spoke about his interest in the natural as opposed to the artificial and the artistic expression of those ideas like Rococo. So consequently, we start to see these different ideas of quote-unquote natural art emerging in France, England, and the United States at this time. And these artistic works show the ordinary life, right? The natural world and sentimentality as subjects in art rather than these kind of aristocratic plays, right? So artists like Boucher, who had featured in their works the frivolous, artificial style of the Rococo period, started to be criticized, particularly by these French philosophers, and this institutes this change in French society. Diderot, the author of the encyclopedia, was very, very harsh, in particular on Rococo artists, and he praised other artists like Chardin here who show this new, more natural, more genuine representation of the French society. So this painting, Saying Grace, is a very good example of the new art. Instead of showing an opulent interior of the Rococo style and the French aristocracy, Chardin is featuring a modest room of a French house where a family is about to sit for dinner. A mother instructs her little child in front on how to pray before the dinner. So that's the subject matter. And if you also look at the style, the form that we have here, the composition is very simple, right? Very honest. It should remind us maybe of genre scenes of Dutch painters of the previous century like Vermeer. But notice the colors too, they're earthy, right? So you have this choice, these choices being made that kind of affect subliminally how we're going to read this painting and how we're going to read these family morals that are being put forth by Chardin. So this is really important for us as we move forward, and this is also taken in a different direction, but still these same kind of ideas by another French artist, Greuze, who followed the ideas of Chardin and excelled in representing the natural environment and these kind of sentimental scenes of everyday life. So for instance, here we have the village bride and we have a groom who's presumably offering a gift of money to a father and a mother for his beloved bride who has her arm through his, but notice that the father and the mother seem a little reluctant, right? So there's a kind of lovely, humorous family dynamic here. But what's interesting is that, now as we're looking back at these works, we can also say that these more kind of natural scenes are also a little bit constructed. They're also a little bit artificial in nature because, now hang with me here, because the Industrial Revolution is going on. The Industrial Revolution is changing just about everything of people's lives at this point. And so these paintings show a kind of nostalgia for something that's already disappearing. So that's why some scholars call them a little bit artificial, and that they're this way of life that these French naturalist painters depict things is already disappearing, and so that they're trying to hold on to something that's not there anymore. Regardless, I think this is another good example. If we're looking at composition, everything is kind of tucked in tightly, but we lack any of the kind of ostentation. We lack the soft pastel colors. Again, it's earthy, right? So all of these things come together in this painting. So examine this painting and then check your textbook on the section about Greuze and be able to explain how it sums up the characteristics of the more natural genre that we've been talking about. Now, one artist that we can't not talk about in this period who is so important, and also, I'm trying to make sure that we include a wide variety of artists, especially include women in the conversation, is this artist, Elizabeth Louise Vigée-Lebrun, and you can just call her Vigée-Lebrun. She is this really important painter at this period, and she kind of blends. She's a good bridge for us at this point because she kind of takes elements of the Rococo, and she then transitions with this French naturalism into a more kind of natural style that will precede or kind of comment on the arrival of the neoclassical era as well. But I want you to read the section on her, be able to explain her artistic style, her subjects, and her status. Now, Vigée Lebrun is the daughter of a kind of mediocre portrait painter at this time, but notice her last name, Lebrun. This is an important marriage for her. She marries this guy who is something like the great-great-grandnephew of Charles Lebrun, who was the first president of the French Academy, so this very high status artistic family. And essentially, Elizabeth is able to work her way through and begin to float through these aristocratic circles, and she actually becomes a favorite artist of Marie Antoinette, the wife and consort of Louis the 16th. Louis the 16th. So notice here, I want you to pay attention that if we compared this, go back in your mind's eye to that painting, The Self-Portrait by Judith Leister. Look at what's similar, look at what's different. It's most likely here that she's depicting Marie Antoinette in this canvas. So think about how she's portraying herself here. Now, just to give you a quick glimpse of one of her portraits of Marie Antoinette, this is why it's kind of Rococo, kind of French naturalist. This painting was actually made to replace another one that she had done of Marie Antoinette, who was just wearing a kind of very simple chemise dress, and it was apparently very scandalous, so she painted this one instead. But you think of Marie Antoinette, I'm not sure if you think about her at all, but she was known as the kind of scandalous queen who said, "Let them eat cake." Turns out she actually didn't say that. She wasn't that heartless towards the poor, but regardless, she will eventually come down during the French Revolution and be assassinated, and we'll see this come up again in a minute when we talk about David. But here you see these kind of lovely textures, this blend of a kind of more solid depiction than we have in the Rococo period, but we still have this queen being shown in all of her opulence. So Vigée Lebrun was Marie Antoinette's favorite painter, and she eventually, during the French Revolution, Vigée Lebrun will have to leave France in order to kind of save her own life, because as we know, the aristocracy is going to come under fire in more ways than one. So I wanted to show you that, but also now transition and show you a little bit of what's happening in England. The natural taste of France is also happening in England, and the British painters of the more natural style, like William Hogarth, focused on the issues of morality, satire, and narration, telling a story in their art. So I want you to read the section in your textbook on William Hogarth. And so when you read that, then take a look at this painting again and describe how this particular painting supports the tone that's often found in a lot of Hogarth's work. And Hogarth was really popular. So explain why he was so popular and how what he paints speaks to or supports in English culture at this point. Okay, so I also wanted to show you, along with this natural style, the English landscape artist and portrait painter is also an expression of this natural taste. And this British artist, Thomas Gainsborough, was kind of reconciling the natural with the Rococo in his work, and he becomes known first and foremost as a landscape painter. And here you can see the Cornard Wood near Sudbury and Suffolk, and you can kind of see how he's using extreme detail, but also kind of presenting a moral here. And how is this depicting a moral? Gainsborough is perhaps one of the very earliest artists to have conveyed a statement against urban development via a retreat into nature through landscape painting. So that's a big idea that we have here. So he spent his later life in the cities of Bath and London, but he had this desire for the countryside that never ceased. It seems he was always hoping for a better quality of life. He there's this quote that he said, "We must jog on and be content with the jingling of bells, only damn it, I hate the dust, the kicking up of the dust, the being confined in harness to follow the track while others ride in the wagon under cover, stretching their legs in the straw at ease, gazing at green trees and blue skies." So you can see how he's kind of talking about city life and this new development, this change towards urbanism, but at the same time longing for nature. And that's one of the reasons why he paints a good number of landscapes. He's probably most known for his painting The Blue Boy, which you see here, and this is something that comes up in popular culture a good bit, but you have this young boy who's dressed in glistening blue satin that's standing with his left foot placed slightly forward, his left arm resting on his waist, and he's gazing at the viewer in this very majestic pose. So he's, holding a hat with feathers. He's clearly this little aristocrat, but this is also kind of a play for Gainsborough in an exploration of color, right? He's kind of taking to task his learning, but also the things that he was taught by, in particular, Sir Joshua Reynolds, his rival, who had said, that blues in painting always recede, browns and reds push forward. And here he's trying to kind of push against this idea a little bit and to bring forward the blue and make blue pop on the canvas. So this is how he's being kind of modern. His modernity is coming to the fore here with his innovative use of color. So I just bring this forward. It's a pretty famous portrait for these reasons, but also it's kind of enigmatic. Who is this boy? What is Gainsborough trying to do for us here? Also, you're going to see, if you're familiar with the Tarantino film Django Unchained, the reason that Jamie Foxx wears a blue suit is actually a reference to Blue Boy. Anyway, there's lots of popular culture references here. So we talked about the Art Academy, we talked about how there's a classical push at this point, and that all these French artists are learning about both the classical and the Renaissance eras, and we can see this, the influence of artworks that we've talked about already this semester. And so just to talk a little bit more about this, these art academies encourage students to study classical Renaissance works of art as models. So at this point, not only artists, but young men of stature, no matter what their job or even if they had a job at this point in 18th century France, also England, etc., they began to be expected to make what's called the Grand Tour of Europe, seeing the major sites and works of art at this time. Most often, students travel to Italy to see the Renaissance masterpieces in person. It's almost like a tour of duty. But this also takes us back yet again to this interest in Greek and Roman works, which was heightened with excavations at Pompeii in the 18th century. So you have this new understanding of what's happening in the ancient world and seeing that these civilizations were actually pretty advanced rather than being a kind of dark age. And so this interest in the classical era is definitely brought up in this particular period because Pompeii begins to be excavated and people begin to understand more about it in this period, okay? So you have this new style that's emerging out of this called neoclassicism. And the name of this period conveys this renewed interest in classical antiquity, and as it's called, neoclassical or new classical. So we have a number of reasons that this is emerging, but also note at this time that art academies began to establish hierarchies of painting. They continue to be very influential, again, kind of very conservative, that dictated taste to the students, but history painting began to be considered the most noble of the arts at this time, especially in the art academies. So history painting is drawing its iconography from the classical past, and the themes of history painting are supposed to convey these ideas of human behavior, what codes of human behavior are, and give us kind of moral messages. So as an alternative to Rococo, neoclassical art has a moral dignity that is the antithesis of the flamboyance, of the lightness of the Rococo period. It's also a statement kind of against the aristocracy and a statement in favor of democracy, and this is going to be huge. We're going to pull this forward. So although we've seen that Greece and Rome didn't necessarily have true democracies, it was typical of Europeans to kind of take the features that they liked and reinterpret them for themselves, and so they interpreted this democratic ideal in Greece and Rome in the classical eras. So you have this academic emphasis on history paintings. History paintings often depicted these scenes from ancient Greece and Rome, from the Bible, from the history of France. They usually represent these figures performing dramatic gestures and trying to create an emotional response from the viewer. History paintings are also characterized by large dimensions, so they're going to be big. And these paintings are shown at the French Salon. Okay, so the French Salon, this is different than just a room. We have to understand that this is this annual display of artworks that operated between 1725 and 1881. So it was either annual or biannual, once or twice a year, and it was an official exhibition of artists' works that were approved by the French Academy. So exposing your work, exhibiting your work at the Salon is often the only and necessary step for future artists to become recognized in public. However, as we've seen, the Academy of Fine Arts was very selective and conservative while choosing paintings for the exhibition and didn't want to accept any more kind of radical or avant-garde artworks made by artists who broke the rules and the conventions of the established codes of painting. We'll see this especially when we talk about the Impressionists. But so I want you to note here, before we go back and talk about the painting I just showed you, I want you to note also how the paintings are displayed, how they're hung. This is the salon style. It was also called the gentleman's hang, which is kind of awkward. But anyway, notice that they're all kind of jam-packed together. There's no kind of separation between the paintings, and so the viewers are kind of challenged to be able to look at all of these different paintings, especially the ones very, very high up. But so these annual exhibitions, the salons, were a way to artists to show their work and market themselves. So the audience for these works became a lot more public. Rather than just painting for specific patrons, you have these salons that allow for artists to show their work and eventually make their work not for specific patrons, but for eventual sale. So they're going to also kind of be paying attention then to what's popular. And neoclassicism is the favorite and most popular art style in the salons of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. So again, just kind of showing you this work by Angelica Kauffman. If you compare her relatively simple composition to the previous Rococo genre with these lush landscapes and pastel pink frocks and, frolicking cherubs and putti flying through the sky, it's pretty clear that art is moving in a different direction at this time. And this painting is an example of virtue, a model of virtue, as you think about the swing being this kind of lover's romp and probably an extramarital affair. Here we have Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi. And this is a painting from ancient Rome, and the story is of Cornelia, this ancient Roman woman who is the mother of future political leaders, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. And the brothers Gracchi were politicians in the 2nd century BC of Rome. And these guys, these two future leaders, were actually seekers of social reform, and they were seen as friends to the average Roman citizen. So you're seeing this kind of in this revolutionary era, right? That these ideas about moving against the aristocracy are beginning to be shown here in artwork, that you have these kind of democratic ideals of these children that are here, and they're learning, ostensibly they're learning these morals, these ethics from their mother Cornelia. And you see Kauffman's painting here illustrating this example of Cornelia's teachings. And we know this from the kind of stories around Cornelia, but essentially a visitor comes to her home to show off a wonderful array of jewelry and precious gems, what you might call treasure, right? But when the visitor asks Cornelia to reveal her treasures, she humbly brings her children forward instead of running to get her own jewelry box. So the message here is clear. This treasure is the French or the family, right? Not the French family, but the family in general. That children, our future, are the most important treasures of any woman. You can almost feel the embarrassment when you look at the face of the visitor, who Kaufman paints with this furrowed brow and slightly gaped mouth, like, oops. But so here you have these ancient Roman ethics, these ancient Roman stories about the importance of the family and also the importance of the everyman, that these children are going to grow up to be protectors of the average Roman citizen. So you can see how these ideas come forward here in neoclassical painting. Also notice that we're starting to see neoclassical style here in Kaufman's work, but also in David, this difference in style, right? That it's very linear versus painterly, that it's opaque versus soft. Again, maybe if we go back here to see Rococo, how these are different. That it's linear, again, rather than having these undulating lines. That it's moral versus decadent. These ideas are really key as we move forward. But now I want to switch and shift gears and talk about the most important neoclassical painter as we're moving directly into neoclassicism proper. He is the most influential history painter in the French neoclassicist movement. This is Jacques-Louis David. And David lives from 1748 to 1825, excuse me. But he is probably our most important neoclassical painter. He's very much a part of the French Revolution, and I say that because his art clearly serves a political purpose, but it's not in the service of the existing government, but to change government and change the sentiments of the people. Okay, so that's really key here. David studied art in Rome, so we can begin to see a classical influence, and he rebelled against Rococo, favoring classical or Renaissance models instead. David believed that art should be moralistic and also heroic. It should serve as a model of civic virtue for people and to move them to personal heroism after viewing this work of art. So here he's borrowing subject matter again from Roman history, but these stories are really popular among the French audiences at the time. Plays were often based on stories such as this. So the story here, the subject matter, comes from the early days of Roman history when Rome and a city called Alba were at war. And so essentially these two sides decided to resolve their conflict in a series of 3 encounters waged by 3 representatives from each side. So here we see 3 Roman brothers, the Horatius brothers, swearing on their swords held by their father to win or die for Rome. The message here is that you should be willing to die for your country. Patriotism, nationalism being key here. However, you have these 3 brothers going to fight 3 other brothers, one of whom was the fiancé of their sister. So the woman that you see here, the women that you see to the right, are the brothers of the Horatius brother, or the sisters of the Horatius brothers, and these women are not heroic, but seeming to be swooning in despair about the fate of either their brothers or one of them's fiancé, right? So the women express feelings of love and sorrow, whereas the men are patriotic and valiant. This reflects gender stereotypes of the time. So even though the Enlightenment thought promoted individual freedom, women didn't really count at this time. That's neither here nor there, but that's, as far as David is concerned, we see that differently in Kaufman's work, obviously. But these men are perfect heroes for David because they symbolize a willingness to die for one's belief and one's country. And we see that being especially resonant in the years just before the French Revolution. Essentially, through this painting, David is telling the French public that they should be willing to make a similar stand, right? And David has this belief that art can change or reform society, so he intends to make statements to the public with his art. Even though this one was actually done under royal patronage before the revolution, we can read this subversive message in it. People should be willing to die for their beliefs as they're going to have to do in the revolution. This was publicly displayed a few years after it was painted, and the public loved it, and some say that it aroused their patriotic zeal. This painting was considered a guide for moral behavior in increasingly troubled France, and the French would have gotten this meaning. The story was really popular at the time. So notice here we've talked about the subject matter, we've talked about what it means, this overall message, but notice too the style, right? You have these illusionistic, crisp forms that are typical of French neoclassicism and also typical of his training in the academy. You have this clarity of line, this force of the representation in this Roman setting. Notice the round arches. All of this is part and parcel of the neoclassical style. And again, it's very dramatic. It's trying to draw out this emotive response from you as the viewer. So as we move into revolution proper here, at the end of the 18th century, there was a growing desire for self-rule. There was growing disillusion with monarchies and their lavish spending and disdain for the people and the aristocracy as well. And so this was a time of revolution. America declared independence in 1776, which will lead others to want independence. We're going to talk about America in a second. The French Revolution broke out in 1789 and overthrew the monarchy. People began standing up for individual rights. This grew out of the Enlightenment. And continuing with David, we're going to talk just a bit more about the French Revolution and then step back to what was going on in North America and get as far as we have time, essentially. So the French Revolution broke out in 1789, and David was a major part of it. He joined a militant faction of revolutionary fighters, and he served as their minister of propaganda. Again, we've talked about how he believed that art should serve the public, right? And he says here that art should contribute to the education of the public. So what we see now is this exalted role for the artist in society, that art becomes this agent for social change. So that elevates the importance of the artist too, right? And so here we have the death of Marat. And Marat was a revolutionary. He was a writer and a friend of David's who was assassinated. He was stabbed to death while taking this medicinal bath. He had a skin issue. And so this painting is made to inspire fellow revolutionaries to act. This painting gives us a very, very stark representation of Marat's assassination. He was in the process of writing a letter when an assassin gained admittance, claiming to need to deliver him a letter, and then she stabbed him. So the knife that killed him is included at the bottom, and he shows us this powerful moment of death. Notice the red of the wound, how the blood actually dips in and drips in and fills the bathtub. You can see it dripping below as well. So he draws together this bright red and contrasts it with this bright green as well. So you have these complementary colors, and you have the green rug, the papers, and the pen all coming together to give us this very powerful moment. David promised his peers in the National Convention that he would depict their murdered friend invocatively as writing for the good of the people, that he died writing for the good of the people. So we have all of that here. So this death of Marat is designed to commemorate this personal hero of the people of France. Although, if you look a little closer, you see this name Charlotte Corday, and she is the name of his assassin. So although the name of Charlotte Corday can be seen on the paper that's held in his left hand, she herself is not visible. And so I think it's kind of interesting to note that in the kind of scale of the composition. Close inspection of this painting shows him at his very last breath, and this is, if you know the story, Corday and many others were still nearby. She didn't even try to escape. So this painting names the assassin, but this is not really about her. This is about Marat. And this is, if you notice the box that's by the bath, it says, "To Marat from David." And so really here, David is intending to record all of the details here. The painting as a whole is a methodical construction focusing on the victim. That, you have these very stark surroundings. And this piece is a change from David's other works because it focuses on a contemporary moment, not a historical one. But he's using the kind of elements of history painting. He's showing Marat as this martyr to the French cause, much like the Christian saints or the classical heroic figures like the Horatii brothers are martyrs or sacrificing themselves for the cause. So that's all to be kind of read here. This is meant to inspire his viewers with a new kind of civic religion, right? Having its own martyrs, but giving us this kind of moment of revelation in the midst of revolution, if that makes sense. So, kind of inspiring the viewers to act, but also kind of giving this new civic impulse, this drive to kind of give yourself over to the revolution and to state as well, the new government, the new state. So I also just wanted to briefly show you, scooting past this for a second, but I wanted to briefly show you too that David actually depicts Marie Antoinette as she's being led to her execution via guillotine. And here he does this quick sketch. He's in the crowd. And I just wanted to show you this very stark representation as opposed to how she was shown, Marie Antoinette was shown in the work of Vigée Lebrun. Here we have her in a very simple dress, in a simple hat with no wig, hands tied behind her, but there's still a kind of dignity in the midst of this as she's going to her death as well. So we see David and David's influence, David's impetus to kind of record the revolution as it's going on around him, thinking about his beliefs about the role of art and his intention with art, especially this death of Marat, and how it kind of changes the trajectory of what art is supposed to do. And we see this concept over and over again in this moment of kind of worldwide turmoil, such as here in The Death of General Wolfe by Benjamin West. Now, I realize this is a little bit earlier than some of the David works that we've looked at, but this is in very much the same vein, okay? Now, Benjamin West was born in Pennsylvania in the American colonies, shall we say. And then he participated in that Gentleman's Grand Tour where he saw the art of the European continent. He was immensely successful. He became the official painter to King George III, the King George of our Revolution, which hopefully you know from your art history classes, or at least from the Hamilton musical, right? But West kept that position as court painter to King George even through the years of the Revolution. But this is a painting from before then. So in this painting, West uses the history painting that was so popular in the work of David and his contemporaries, but he departed from conventions into kind of important regards. Generally, history paintings were reserved for narratives from the Bible or from the classical past. Instead, West depicts this near contemporary event, and he does this a little bit before David does this with Marat, right? This is an event from the 7 Years' War, or known as the French and Indian War in North America. And this is the moment when Major General James Wolfe was mortally wounded on the plains of Abraham, right outside of Quebec. So, without doubt, the dying general is the focus of the composition here. West paints Wolfe lying down at the moment of his death, wearing the red uniform of a British officer, and a circle of men attend to their dying commander. So what's happening in this painting? In the background, and to the left of the men surrounding Wolfe, we have this approaching runner. You see him in the kind of middle ground here, and he's waving his hat in one hand to get their attention. In the other hand, he's carrying a captured flag with the fleur-de-lis, the symbol of France. So this is symbolic of the news being relayed to the dying Wolfe that the French were being defeated, so that he can know that his death is not in vain, right? But also notice here in the very front, I just want to call our attention to this depiction of the Native American warrior in the painting. He's kneeling with his chin on his fist. He's looking at General Wolfe. And how this Native American appears here has been analyzed in a lot of different ways. But in art, and we're going to see this over and over again, the art of kind of kneeling or touching your face with your hand, resting your face on your hand, is a sign of deep thought and intelligence. And so some people consider this inclusion of this Native American as a kind of idealization here, inspired by the noble savage concept. So trying to idealize the Native Americans, even though he's being shown without a shirt, and this kind of without shoes being a kind of different depiction of, rather than a civilized Anglo soldier here, but you have this kind of inclusion of him as being really important here. So this inclusion is actually a little bit of fiction. The General Wolfe had actually considered Native Americans to be irredeemable barbarians, cruel and depraved. And what's more, they fought exclusively for the French, for the other side. So there's a kind of bizarre notion that Wolfe would have tolerated the presence of any at the moment of his death. This would have been a kind of bitter jest to anyone who was familiar with his prejudices. But West's sentiments were pretty different, actually quite different. West had seen the Mohawks employed not as enemies but as allies of the British in Pennsylvania, and had idealized them as embodiments of native nobility. But maybe the most important way that West worked with tradition here is he's portraying the painting's protagonist as Christ-like. West was clearly influenced by the innumerable images of the dead Christ in Lamentation and Deposition paintings and the Pietà by Michelangelo that he would have seen during his time in Italy. And so this deliberate visual association here between the dying General Wolfe and the dead Christ underscores this British officer's admirable qualities. If Christ was innocent, pure, and died for a worthwhile cause, the salvation of mankind, right, then Wolfe too is innocent, pure, and dying for a worthwhile cause, the advancement of the British position in North America. So West is transforming Wolfe from this simple war hero to a deified martyr for the British cause. And this message is further enhanced by the thousands of engravings that soon flooded the art market of this painting. So this painting was very popular in English and abroad. And so I bring this in. This death of General Wolfe retains this position as a landmark painting in the history of American art. In it, West is reinterpreting the rules of what a history painting could be, both in regard to the period depicted and to the attire that the figures wore, and at the same time, he's following a visual language that would have been familiar to its 18th century audience. So you can see a lot of things going on here, this kind of treatment of what's happening in the contemporary era with the kind of grandeur and moral element, and also classical allusions or even Christian allusions that you have in contemporary painting or history painting. So this composition essentially sets the stage for the many quote-unquote contemporary history paintings that are going to kind of flood the stage after this, including those by John Singleton Copley. And I want to spend a minute to talk about John Singleton Copley. First of all, he's one of my all-time favorite artists. I think he's absolutely a technician, and how he is mostly self-taught is pretty amazing to me. But he unexpectedly illuminated America's colonial sky, so to speak. So he was the child of poor, uncultured parents. He was briefly the stepson of an artist, and by 1760, he became, as if by providence, the colony's supreme artist. And this is a position that he's going to retain until he departs for London in 1774 to meet Benjamin West. He ascended the colonial ladder quickly, and he had this kind of sustained eminence. He had staying power as a famous artist, and they were the result of his kind of inborn or innate ability to handle paint and produce images that had eclipsed anything beyond what had come before him by his predecessors in America. So Copley, here's a self-portrait of him a little bit later, 1780 through 84, and I show you this just so you can kind of get an idea of his brushwork and what he's able to do, how he's able to convey a sense of naturalism in his paintings. I want to start with a painting that's a little bit earlier. I'm mainly going to talk about two, but I can definitely point you in the direction if you find yourself as enamored of him as I am. But anyway, this one is of Paul Revere, and most of you guys know Paul Revere from what? The Midnight Ride, American Revolution, right? So this is one of his more famous works. Paul Revere was an incredibly accomplished silversmith. Revere occasionally made silver frames for the miniature portraits that Copley painted, so there was probably a mutual respect, but this portrait also may have been painted as a means of repayment for that. At any rate, we have this portrait of Paul Revere. And he is painting Revere in this familiar setting of a workspace. He's wearing his work clothes, he's wearing the shirt of an artisan, and the fingernails of his left hand are dirty. So he appears here to pause in his craft, pause in his labor as if he's carefully considering the next step in his work or reflecting more generally on, being a silversmith in general or just being a craftsman, right? He holds his chin thoughtfully. By picturing Revere as a thinker as much as a maker, Copley suggests that Revere engages the world with his mind as well as his hands. So again, we have this position, this pose, similar to the Native American in the West painting, right? This idea of that's denoting thinking and interior thought. So his work requires thought and vision, and despite his work clothes, Revere behaves as this artist gentleman, someone whose contemplative pose suggests the intellectual habits of the upper class. So this portrait of Revere is more than just a portrait, it's revealing even Copley's own aspirations to higher social status as an artist. It's basically a portrait of the artisan as artist. But I also here wanted to draw your attention to the teapot. As with everything you see here, this is really showing off Copley's ability to capture texture and to show his awareness of how things appear in real life. So the distorted reflection, all of that. But not only is this teapot painted beautifully, it's not just a way for him to demonstrate his skill and mastery of paint, it's also letting us know something about being a silversmith, and that this is the depiction of this economy of objects and cultural practices. And when I say this, I want to talk just for a second about silver in the colonial American culture, because silver was incredibly important. Silver objects were incredibly important. There is this bowl called the Sons of Liberty Bowl. It's now considered one of the United States' most cherished historical treasures, and he had done this bowl the same year that Copley paints this. So the Liberty Bowl honored 92 members of the Massachusetts House of Representatives who refused to rescind a letter sent throughout the colonies protesting the Townshend Act. So basically, it's this kind of act of civil disobedience that Paul Revere commemorates in this bowl. And so silver becomes this ceremonial, religious, public commodity that's used in a number of different places in public as well as in the home. Churches in particular served as major patrons of colonial silversmith, and silver was not just more valuable as a material than pewter or whatever else you would use to create utensils and things like that. It was also something that required a high level of artisanal skill and labor. And here you can see this set of 6 tankards bought by the Third Church of Brookfield, Massachusetts, with funds that were provided in a will of one of the members of the church. And these kinds of gifts had been common practice since the earliest years of colonial settlement. So in church, Congregationalists and other kind of Protestants of this period took communion from beakers, 2-handled cups, and mugs and tankards like this. So these were the same vessels that were used in the home to drink as cider or beer, and just as at home, they were passed around between those that came together. So the art of silversmithing was seen everywhere, and it was also this communal art, right? It was it was a status symbol that could be passed down from generation to generation. So it's kind of important to note that even though Paul Revere is known as a craftsman, that it's a respected tradition, okay? So silver was an art form in the colonies that was useful in many ways. In its literal sense, you could drink from objects made of silver, or eat on it, or wear it, but it was also beautiful to look at, and it would increase in value over time. So, in a way, Copley is making a commentary on Paul Revere, but also on the overall status of artists and how important they are to economic life, public life, community life, all of this together, and that he's doing it in this essentially very refined way. So he was known for his portraits. You can see his portraits all over in museums. They're absolutely phenomenal. But now I want to shift gears and talk about Watson and the Shark. This is a fascinating painting on a lot of levels, and it's really important, and I want to talk a little bit about it as far as a cultural commentary, as far as something that happened in Copley's own life, and then also as this new bridge from what we're going to talk about from neoclassicism moving into romanticism. We'll get fully into romanticism later, not today, but just to kind of show you these precedents. So, in 1778, what is going on, right? 1776, we had declared our independence, and Copley had gone to London at the time to get some European artistic exposure and to meet with another painter there, especially Benjamin West, who he'd been corresponding with for years. And while he was abroad, he was labeled by some very unfriendly folks back in the colonies as a Tory or as a British loyalist. And I want to take a moment to say that if you look at Copley's writings, he emphatically was not a Tory, but he wasn't a revolutionary either. He worked really hard to establish his own neutrality during the whole thing. Regardless, being labeled a Tory, it wasn't really safe when something like that is spread around for him to return to Boston, so he stayed in London and his family met him there, never to come back to the colonies, sadly enough. So, what is this painting telling us? We have a man with flowing blonde hair in the water, with this really dynamic composition of figures trying to help him, while a odd shark, shall we say, opens his jaws in attack in the bottom right. So, here we have this story that he is giving us. It is a kind of contemporary history painting again. So there's our man with the flowing blonde hair. This is Watson, Brooke Watson. I'll tell you the story in a second. And then here you have the shark. I think it's first things first, Copley had never seen a shark, and so this is his estimation of what a shark would look like based on other people's descriptions. So that's why it looks this way. Now, if you notice, the shark is absolutely huge. Its body goes out of the picture plane and then back into it, right? So it's generally agreed upon that Copley knew Watson. Brooke Watson was a real person. He was about 13 or 14 when this happened. This event actually happened down in Havana. He had been on a boat. He had stripped off his sailing clothes for a swim in the water when a shark attacked him twice, biting off his right leg. On the third attack, the shark was beaten down and stabbed and driven away by a boat hook. So this is a great example, first of all, of this very dynamic moment, right? You can see the blood kind of flowing around his right leg in the water. And a term that we're going to talk about over and over again from here on out is this idea of the sublime. And the sublime is a Enlightenment concept that I'll talk more about later, but it's this idea that terror can cause pleasure if viewed from a safe distance. So that's the basic idea, right? So here you have the injured Watson, whose pale body is on the surface of the water, the leg already injured, blood swirling around, and the faces of the crewmen are emotional and in shock, dread, and compassion. Then you have this really dynamic figure who's about to thrust his spear down into the shark. And he, if you look at clothes, this is important for social codes and understanding different cultural positions. This guy who is holding the spear is an upper class figure as opposed to the other guys. He is wearing silk stockings, silver buckles, and a new navy coat. And so you have an upper class figure here that's being very dynamic. Now, going back to the shark for a second, because this ties into what this guy is doing and why he's depicted this way, the shark incarnates evil, right? With its open jaws. A lot of scholars talk about how the open jaws represent the gaping mouth of hell or evil. And many scholars talk about the fact that the shark is based on, the shark and this figure with the spear are based on pre-existing models of either St. George or the Archangel Michael, who fought the dragon or the devil, depending on the story. But you can see how he's kind of drawing upon artistic precedent. Like you have here this painting by Raphael or Roger van der Weyden, or even if you go back to the Donatello relief sculpture that we looked at earlier, right? There's a kind of association being made here of this valiant young man defeating evil with this spear. Then you have these two figures who are reaching in to the water to grab Watson from the water just in time. And their figures, how they're structured, are actually allusions to some of Copley's favorite themes. The biblical story of the miraculous draft of fishes by Raphael and by Peter Paul Rubens. And we actually know that Copley actually copied some of these, made sketches of these paintings, so you can see how they're kind of tied in. So you have a spearman who is about to conquer this incarnation of evil, and then you have these two men who are about to do a miraculous pull from the boat. And I showed you those examples, the early art historical examples, because Copley is expecting his audience to know about this. Copley is expecting this erudite audience. He's in England, which is a place where there's more wealth for someone who can buy a painting that's not a portrait, but though he'll still do portraits through the rest of his career. But it's also a public that would have most likely been familiar with many of the great Renaissance masterpieces. So you have this making this artwork that's making a statement, this larger allegorical point about the power and interceding salvation of God, if you tie this into those biblical stories, the religious stories, right? But it's also this commentary on art history as well. So this is where I'm bringing in the neoclassical era, that he's referencing these earlier periods with these stories of morals, but tying them into this contemporary moment, okay? But if we're thinking about this as a 1778 painting, he's painting this in the midst of the American Revolution, and being born in America and being in England, this shouldn't be just coincidental. This is also a comment about the revolution in a way, and about the greater American project. And how do we know that? Well, there's a pretty major figure that we haven't talked about yet. And that is this black man in the center of the composition. The whole composition basically makes a triangle from Watson to the shark, up the harpoonist to this man. This guy is visually connected twice to Watson. Once by this rope that you see him holding in his left hand that he's thrown out to Watson, and then again in the echoing of their outstretched arms out to each other. But look at his face. His face is filled with compassion. Copley has given him psychological depth and profound humanity. And think about when he's doing this. He's challenging contemporary racial assumptions of the time, and this is basically unprecedented and unparalleled in the 18th century. Why is he doing this? I think this is something we should think about. Copley is maybe calling attention to the social complications that are pervading colonial culture in the years leading up to the revolutions. Americans were fighting for their independence when they were still dependent upon slave labor for their commercial success. So I think that is the reason why he gives this guy such prominent position here. So even though Copley was labeled as a British loyalist, I think Watson and the Shark works to tell us a different story, right? The painting draws together the transatlantic worlds of Europe and America and their mutual dependence on slave labor from Africa. But it also imagines a world that functions as a microcosm for the larger world. Individuals from different social classes, again, you have differences in clothes here marking difference in social rank between all of these different guys. And all of these guys from different social classes are working together in this heroic effort of cooperation and interdependence. They all need each other to pull this off. So in a way, I think this is a coded commentary on the utopian vision of America and all of these things that are going on at this time. So this utopian vision and history painting also, are working on the viewer. The work, as we saw with David, Copley is wanting the viewer to see this and have a reaction and maybe be inspired to take action. So this kind of gives us this overall idea about working to make your own culture, your own community better. And these are, I think, neoclassical ideas at their finest, and something that's pervading through the Enlightenment, etc. So I bring all this together to show you kind of what's going on in different parts of the world at this time, but to hopefully show you some connecting threads. And I think we'll pause here, stop here, and pick up again with neoclassicism, romanticism as we move forward, and again, tie these threads together, okay? So please let me know if you have any questions. I hope you guys have a great week.